So we talked about Evan's tweet yesterday. Again, professional journalist Evan, who's sharing this clip of Lula da Silva talking about Ukraine and articulating an idea, which, as I pointed out to Evan, which didn't seem to make any impact on him whatsoever, articulating an idea that is widely held across the world. That it's not, when you talk about Russia and Ukraine, it's not just this one-sided good versus evil thing, but that the US and Canada and NATO played a role in provoking it and have played a significant role in prolonging it way longer than it needed to go on. That's all. That's all he was saying. And again, this is not some like Putinist Kremlin propaganda thing. This is like what the majority of the world believes. You know, sometimes when we say like the world stands with Ukraine and all this stuff, what we mean is all of the formerly colonialist, predominantly white countries stands with Ukraine, and anything outside that narrative is like Kremlin propaganda. Completely false, though. Most of the world actually takes this kind of nuanced view on it. They're either like neutral on it, or they openly support Russia's side in the conflict. So when Lula talks about that, there's more than, it's not just about Russia and Ukraine. There's more than one country that was involved in this. The West has prolonged it, and they helped provoke it. This shouldn't be controversial. This is widely held. This is a view that's widely held throughout the world, throughout the non-Western world. And the way Evan again, professional journalists who are not supposed to editorialize and like inject their own personal beliefs. I know Evan thinks that he's totally impartial journalist and doesn't even have personal beliefs or ideology, or as he explains to me in this conversation, has this belief in the rule of international law, this fervent belief in international law that he applies to everybody. So he doesn't think that he even has an ideology. And he doesn't think that he does editorialize or inject his personal beliefs, but then he obviously does. Look, when I talk about that completely uncontroversial stance that Lula articulated there, and then he says, Lula in China falsely claims the decision to start the Ukraine war was made by two countries, and then suggesting that Ukraine asked to be invaded, which again, that's not what Lula said at all. That's Evan Dyer's own personal editorialized interpretation that he included in that. That's not anywhere near what Lula said in that clip. And then he says he also blamed the US and EU for prolonging the conflict by helping Ukraine defend itself. Sorry, but that's true. That's just true. That's just objectively true. That's just objectively true. I'm sorry to say. Yes, the US and EU have prolonged the conflict by pumping billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine. And as I and Lula and others have argued, helped provoke the conflict by pumping billions of dollars into Ukraine prior to February 2020, or whenever it was at this point, 2022. They've been pumping billions of dollars into Ukraine prior to that. The international rule of law oversaw 1 million Iraqi deaths. Well, this is where Evan tries to create some distance as well, because he says, well, I think the Iraq war was illegal against international law, just as I think the invasion of Ukraine was illegal. This is how he tries to like maintain this stance of like objectivity. I would be interested to know whether Evan Dyer, what he was saying in 2002 and 2003 about the Iraq war, if there's evidence that Evan Dyer was using whatever journalistic platform he had at that time to argue that the war was illegal and argue against the war, I would be happy to see it. I am not familiar. I haven't seen it. I've learned about a lot of these people, like, again, in spite of myself. So if he was actually using his platform at that time to denounce the war, I would be happy to see evidence of that. Maybe he was. I don't want to assume that he wasn't. Maybe he was. Or is he only saying it now with the benefit of hindsight and years later when it's no longer controversial or unpopular to say this is an illegal war? That's kind of what I'm interested to know. You know, it's easy to say that you're against the Iraq war now, but what were you saying in 2003? That's kind of my question. I mean, maybe he was against it. I don't know. I would be interested to know if he did think the war was illegal as he claims in this thread. What was he doing at that time to promote that idea? Because not a lot of mainstream journalists in Canada or the United States were making that point in 2003. That's a good question as well, Metal Dipshit. If he thinks the Iraq War was illegal, does he support war crime charges against U.S. officials? It's a good question. I don't know. That's something that Evan would have to answer. I'm not sure. You know what? I better tweet that I'm talking about this because I have a tweet that like people are sharing right now about this. So maybe I should promote that I'm doing the stream under that tweet. Okay. So that would be we'll get to that though. But that would be my question when it comes to Iraq and Evan Dyer's fixation on international law. Because as he talks about, he equates the invasion of Iraq with Ukraine and says, well, they're both illegal and I'm against them both. I'm interested to know what Evan was saying in 2003. I'm not claiming one of Evan Dyer's forefathers committed the Armachar massacre in India in 1919, but the English colonel who did it was Colonel Reginald Dyer. Oh boy. Oh boy. Anyway, when we're having this conversation about state media, I think this is an interesting place to start. We're going to get into the whole like Elon Musk CBC thing, but I think this is a good question. Like, is Evan Dyer part of a state media apparatus? He would obviously tell you that no, he's not, and that no one tells him what to say, and that he doesn't get kind of bullet points or talking points that he has to talk about. As we know, that is not accurate. And as we know, CBC, while it takes government funding, is only one arm of our sort of state media apparatus in the West, in which all corporate media is a part of. And like as Chomsky would say, if Evan Dyer, it's not that people tell him what to think, but if he believed anything different, he would not be in the position that he's in today. Say Palestine, and listen, to give Evan credit, I've heard, I don't really know, but people have said about Evan Dyer that he's better than most journalists on Israel Palestine. So we'll see. But does he apply the same rigorous critique that he does to Russia and the invasion of Ukraine to Palestine? That's a second question. My understanding, though, is that he is better on this than many journalists in this country. So, if that's true, credit to him for that. I'm trying to be as fair as possible because, as you know, I'm fair and balanced. I'm fair and balanced in all my journalistic endeavors that I participate in. So here's my response, right? Again, I don't think this should be controversial. You do realize that this is what the vast majority of the non-Western world believes. Maybe you should consider whether it's actually you who are wrong about this, which is a pretty satisfying ratio as well. Just pointing that out. This whole thing about what Lula's saying there, like it's some kind of like controversial thing or Kremlin or Beijing propaganda. What Lula's saying in there is just articulating the viewpoint of the vast majority of the people in the world about this conflict. That's my only point that I was making here. Whether or not CBC is state media, it's bland, centrist pablum that does nothing to challenge power. Yeah, and you know what? CBC is capable of doing some decent journalism. But ultimately, CBC is part of a journalistic class which is upholding the status quo and that doesn't meaningfully challenge power in any way, like you're pointing out. It's not like CBC, in an effort to appeal to all different viewpoints, are participating in this marketplace of ideas. Platforms, people like me, who have a totally different perspective, who do challenge power in our economic system or in the geopolitical sphere, of course they don't. And that's part of this kind of like this status quo that CBC is part of upholding. The West didn't impose fundamentalist rule in Afghanistan. It isn't the West that won't let girls go to school. Afghanistan is suffering primarily because of the Taliban and the attitudes that gave rise to the Taliban. Evan Dyer. Is that an actual quote, Dimitri? The amazing thing about that quote is, and as you'll see in this thread, he complains, Evan, about tankies like me who just blame the West for everything, right? They just blame the West for everything. They got this double standard. They blame the West for every single conflict.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
They blame the West for every single conflict, and they let all these like human rights abusing authoritarian regimes off the hook. Thank you, Dimitri, for sharing that. There it is. The West didn't impose fundamentalist rule in Afghanistan. It isn't the West that won't let girls go to school. Afghanistan is suffering primarily because of the Taliban and the attitudes that gave rise to the Taliban. Ironically, the West did, in fact, impose fundamentalist rule on Afghanistan. As we've learned about on this program, when the PDPA, the legitimate government of Afghanistan in the late 80s, was trying to create a socialist system in Afghanistan that promoted and supported and upheld women's rights, that promoted education and literacy, and had all these progressive social policies, what did the West do? The West came in and armed and funded these reactionary fundamentalists to destroy that. And when the PDPA reached out to the Soviet Union for help and the Soviet Union invaded, we then, after encouraging and supporting this proxy war, sat back and said, oh, look at this barbaric Russian invasion. Doesn't that kind of sound familiar? It sounds a little bit familiar to me, doesn't it? But we quite literally did impose this fundamentalist rule. When there was an effort in Afghanistan to destroy the power of these religious fundamentalists, we were on the side of the fundamentalists. So we quite literally did impose fundamentalism. That's not even a remote exaggeration. Which is the amazing thing. That's the thing that Evan just doesn't seem to realize. Like he's either ignorant to it or just completely unwilling to interrogate this anyway. So anyway, here is my take. You do realize this is what the vast majority of the non-Western world believes. This guy, Warren, who seems nice, I don't know, says, oh, that's a bad take. And, you know, since that kind of annoys me, I don't think Warren, whoever you are, your friendly neighborhood commie propaganda outlet, I don't think you know more about Lula, the president of Brazil, about this subject, or the large number of people around the world that believe in that viewpoint. You know, I think it's a little bit arrogant to be like, whoa, no, I know more. I know more than all these people, you know? So yeah, I find that kind of annoying. And he says, okay. Our friend Swirly of my life says, it is okay. And this guy says, I don't understand the point of having debate around this. If the point is that the West stoked the war into happening, then the bar is so low that virtually any conflict on Earth can be blamed on the West. That's right, Warren. And here's where Evan springs into action. And here's where we're going to see the ideology. Again, Evan Dyer, I'm sure if you asked him, would never dream of suggesting that he has some kind of like ideology that he's injecting into his journalism. He's just a straight shooter, fair and balanced journalist who just has no ideology and is just has this kind of outlook of calling balls and strikes, right? I'm sure that's what he would say if you asked him about it. But here's where you see the ideology creep in, right? So here's what he says. He says, Warren, the whole point is to blame any and all conflict on Earth on the West. For the crew you're debating with, this has always been the point. You or I might condemn both the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as unprovoked and illegal. They never will. So again, drawing the comparison between Iraq and Ukraine, and we've broken that down as well before, how that analogy kind of falls apart a little bit as well, considering, I know I've talked about it before, but just to reiterate again, you know, what are the differences between the Iraq war and the invasion of Ukraine? Number one, Iraq is around the world from America. It's tens of thousands of miles away, has nothing to do, would pose no threat to America whatsoever. Number one. Number two, all of the weapons of mass destruction and all the things that we claimed were the reasons for the invasion that posed a threat to America were complete bullshit, were total lies. So that's two things. On those 2 points, Ukraine is Russia's next door neighbor. Historically, a long tradition of being part of, if not the same country, part of the same society, an integral part of the same society, a key cog in the Soviet Union. A long history of friendship and cooperation between these two nations, these two cultures, very similar cultures. So it's not halfway around the world, it's right next door. Number two, all the justifications that Russia used to invade Ukraine, whether or not you agree with the invasion or not, whether you denounce it or not, I think it's illegal or not. NATO expansion, these fascist militias in Ukraine.
This is some guy, Rob Russo, some leftist based in Canada. I was turned on to this sick individual, and I found this.
Grom, thank you for the raid. Thank you, Grom. Welcome. Bring it in, Grom Raiders. What is up? Thank you for joining us. Welcome in. Smash the follow button. Smash the follow button. I'm Rob. Hello. Nice to meet you. What is up? So, I'm just talking about this conversation I had with state propagandist Evan Dyer of CBC, and breaking down what his points are and what he gets wrong, and how Evan Dyer is a stenographer for state power, which while still holding this idea that he's like some objective journalist. So yeah, Iraq and Ukraine. Number one, Ukraine, Russia's next door neighbor. Number two, all of the bullshit that were used to justify the war in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, anthrax, support for Al-Qaeda, all these things, complete bullshit, total lies. Whereas when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, you look at NATO expansion, you look at the Euromaidan, these neo-Nazi militias, NATO pumping in billions of dollars worth of arms. Whether you think that justifies the invasion or not, or whether you condemn the invasion or think it's illegal or not, those were real things that were happening, That's not that's not Kremlin propaganda. These are real, actual things. NATO did indeed expand directly up to their border after they repeatedly said, stop expanding to our border or we're going to consider that a threat to our security. Whether you like it or not, those are real things that were happening. And number three, as brutal as the invasion has been, I don't want to downplay the violence that's happened. If you look at the shock and awe campaign on Baghdad versus the way Russia has engaged with Kiev and the capital, no comparison. I'm sorry, no comparison. There hasn't been this shock and awe bombing campaign targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure in Kiev that we saw in Baghdad in 2003. Zero comparison between these two things. Sorry, just one sec. Are you sure about that? I'm pretty sure, yeah. I don't think there's been this. I don't think you can compare the bombing campaign that we saw in Baghdad in moment one of the war, the Iraq war. They immediately bombed the capital into fucking smithereens. There's been bombing in Kiev, but nowhere near to the same extent, though. Anyway, I'm not trying to downplay any violence that's happened. I'm not. I don't support the invasion. I think war is terrible and it should be avoided at all costs. But I'm just pointing out where that I think this analogy between the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Ukraine is a little bit flimsy. And people like Evan say well, they're both illegal. And look at me, I'm just calling balls and strikes. Iraq illegal, Ukraine illegal, while ignoring all those other contextual elements. Yeah, other parts of Ukraine are a ruin. I don't think anyone would deny that. Yeah, of course not. I mean, again, it is a war that's been going on, so obviously that is true. Oh God. Anyway, so let's continue. So you or I might condemn the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as unprovoked and illegal. They never will. And that's the thing. I will condemn the invasion because I'm against war, and I have condemned it many times, and I've said Putin bad many times as well, despite Evan's statement to the contrary. But no, I'm not going to say that it's unprovoked because it was very clearly provoked. Again, that's not just my opinion. That's not Kremlin propaganda. That's what Lula was articulating in the statement that he was referencing there. That's what the vast majority of the world believe, that yes, NATO and the West did play a significant role in provoking the invasion. So no, I'm not going to say it's unprovoked, because it was provoked. And again, we can hold two ideas in our mind at the same time. Just because it's provoked doesn't mean that you think it's justified. But it was absolutely provoked. He says, if a Western democratic country makes war on an authoritarian country, that is Western aggression. And first of all, the whole Western democratic versus authoritarian, that's an interesting framework as well. You know, where of course the Canada and the US are these Western liberal democracies, and any country that doesn't have a Western style liberal democratic system is authoritarian. That in and of itself is Evan injecting his ideology into the discussion. Mr. Braddock, I'm sorry, but I just don't agree with that. Russia's not worthy of excuses or whataboutism. Russian fascism is the reason for this. Fuck. Putin is literally trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. I don't really think that's accurate. And I don't think Putin is a good guy. I don't think modern Russia is a great place. There's a lot of things that I really think are grotesque about it. That is true. But Russia repeatedly said, as I pointed out yesterday, Russia repeatedly said, here's our red line. We have a red line here. Stop expanding NATO right up to our border. Stop arming Ukraine. Stop pumping arms into Ukraine. They said that repeatedly over and over and over and over again. And Canada and the US and the Western countries just refused to listen. That's why you had people like John Mearsheimer, geopolitical analysts who are not leftists or pro-Putin people. That's why they were saying years ago, what we're doing right now is going to get Ukraine wrecked. They were saying that because they were just listening to what Russia and Putin was saying. So if we didn't want that to happen, we should have stopped doing the things that we were doing to contribute to that happening. You know, I don't think that's like that controversial to say. Oh, was he getting on one about USSR imperialism too? Okay, that's good. There was also, as I pointed out before, the Minsk agreements. You know, Russia was actually negotiating prior to the invasion. They tried to follow a diplomatic route. And people like Angela Merkel have openly admitted that the Minsk agreements were always bullshit, and that was always just a ploy to buy time to continue funding and arming these militias in the first place. So, like, I think we can point out the horror of war, and we can say, yeah, no matter what the context, it doesn't justify a horrible invasion. We can say that, but this idea that it's just this like one-sided good versus evil, black and white thing is just not accurate. It's not historically accurate. So, it's not a realistic assessment of what has actually gone on here. They're going the race science route of the Russian psyche. Exactly. The only people that are violent. The only people that are violent and colonialists. You know? The only people, the Russians. They have this violent gene where they just love to inflict violence on people. Not like us, though. Not like us here in the enlightened Western liberal democracy that we live in. Ugh. So let's continue this though. If he says, and if an authoritarian country makes war on a democratic country, that is Western provocation. The West made them do it. Evan, the fantasies about Nazis, etc., are just window dressing. The fantasies, and carrier wave. I agree with you. I know what you're saying when you point this out. Like, what should they have done? And that's the fundamental question that I think people have a really difficult time grappling with. Like, you know. I think more people should really sit down and think about that question and really look at the last 10 years and what the West has been doing versus what they did, and maybe ask themselves some real critical questions about that. Not enough people are doing that. Right, not America or Canada that have continued to systematically exterminate indigenous people of color at large, and that's not even bringing up the things Mexico has done. I mean, we
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
The Russians have Mongol blood, don't you know? Western liberal who swears they don't subscribe to race science. Seriously, yeah, they all love to reach for the fucking calipers. These like anti-racist Western liberals. Another whole thing, as we've talked about endlessly before as well, is about Putin, the whole Putin bad thing. Well, what's Putin doing there? Why is Putin the leader of Russia? As Evan would say, like, oh, you blame the West for everything. But guess what? Putin is not in power in the first place. Modern Russia, such as it is, doesn't exist were it not for, yet again, Western interference. You know, maybe we should have left the Soviet Union alone. Maybe we should not have deliberately and intentionally overthrown the Soviet Union, leading to this massive human rights calamity, leading to a decade of total abject humiliation and devastation for Russian people and people across the former Soviet republics, leading to a power vacuum that someone like an opportunist like Putin was more than happy to fill. Putin is he's a monstrous person who benefited personally from the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know? But Evan would say, oh, that's just like, you're just suggesting that the West was involved with that is just preposterous. Again, Evan is the one that is completely blind to or is intentionally obfuscating the role of the unequivocal global hegemon, the United States of America, in which the global criminal cartel that the United States of America is the leader of, and that countries like Canada and the UK and Australia and others are junior partners in. Evans just doesn't see that. He doesn't see the role, the obvious role of this massively powerful hegemonic world power in animating these events. And he suggests that it's some kind of tanky delusion to suggest that the West is involved, deeply implicated in these geopolitical affairs. You know, which is nonsense. And again, as much as Evan would suggest that he doesn't have any kind of like ideology in his journalism, that is ideology. When you're ignoring or obscuring the role that the West plays in these conflicts, then you're being intensely ideological. You know, but look at this as well. The fantasies about Nazis are just window dressing. The fantasies about Nazis, like to say nothing of like the mainstream reporting that's been done on this. Far-right extremists in Ukraine brag that they've received training from the Canadian forces. There's been plenty of like mainstream corporate media journalism about these Nazis in Eastern Ukraine and our role in promoting them and providing them with weapons and training. Like, it's not the idea that it's just a fantasy. Like, literally before the conflict, there's CNN and all kinds of different Western corporate media outlets that did plenty of legitimate journalism on this. And Evan, non-ideological, serious journalist, Evan, completely hand waves that away as a fantasy. So completely hand waves away the role that the West plays in these conflicts or in other geopolitical affairs, completely hand waves away the reality, the widely reported on reality of these Nazis in Ukraine. Prior to the conflict and over the last year and a half, how many fucking interviews have we seen with Ukrainian officials and military people? And in every fucking one, there's the UPA flag, there's pictures of Bandera, there's the Sonnenrad, there's other fascist symbols. Like, this is the idea that he's just saying, oh, that's just a fantasy. Oh, it's just a fantasy. You know, that's just preposterous. Like, seriously. And Evan would style himself as being some kind of like objective journalist, not only ignoring the obvious role that the world's major global hegemon plays in these situations, but just like, oh yeah, the evidence of that Nazi problem that we are supporting, that we're arming and funding and training and upholding and diplomatically supporting these very people. Oh, that's just a fantasy. Oh, that's just a fantasy, according to Evan. They'll never admit they fell for the propaganda, or Evan will never admit that he is himself a propagandist. I saw that as well, Graham, about the military instructors in Taiwan. It's getting real. I don't know. We're going to see if China is able to not take the bait in the same way that Russia has. But China, in the same way that Russia had, China is saying very openly, I have another saved tweet about this. President Xi said to Biden, take this shit seriously. President Xi said to Biden, I'm not going to be the president that loses Taiwan. It's not going to happen. They're just like Russia did. China is saying exactly what their red line is, and we're continuing to push right up against it. So when the same fucking thing happens, if it does, all people like Evan are going to be out there wagging their fingers at me and others for pointing this shit out. But no, that's what they're saying. They're being very clear about this, just as Russia was clear about it. God, what an amazing statement. The fantasies about Nazis. And the whole thing about, I think, the idea of, blame any and all conflict on earth on the West. And this statement, when is this from? February 2023. The West didn't impose fundamentalist rule in Afghanistan. That's remarkable. That's really remarkable. Just completely ignoring the role of the West in both Afghanistan and Ukraine. Really fantastic stuff. And again, if you asked Evan, he would tell you that he's some objective journalist and that CBC is in no way some kind of state media apparatus. But we're seeing the ways that Evan, through his mainstream objective J-school style journalism, is upholding a very specific ideological agenda on behalf of the ownership class of Canada and the United States. Another DYER banger. This is amazing. This guy's truly an amazing person. What an amazing mind. Africa has a lot of residual sympathy for Russia because of Soviet support for decolonization. Yeah, you think? Yeah, as I was saying yesterday, these places in Africa, remember who was colonizing them and enslaving them, and who was sending them aid and weapons and materially supporting their anti-colonial struggles. And then we say, why does Russia support Putin? Oh, it's just a mystery. It's just a total mystery. And they forget Ukraine was part of the USSR. Now it's not, though. That's the thing, Evan. Now it's not part of the USSR, and now it's being armed and funded by Now it's being armed and funded and supported by the very same people that were trying to colonize them and enslave them. So yeah, that's the fucking difference. They didn't forget that Ukraine was part of the USSR. They see their former colonial overlords or current colonial overlords, because neocolonialism never went away. They see them now supporting Ukraine, and they see the writing on the wall, and they understand the context of what's going on. Jesus Christ, Evan. The crew you're debating with, he's so condescending. And this guy, Warren, look, he says he's a fan of me. I don't want to shit on Warren. I don't agree with what he was saying, and I think he was, that's not great, but he says, I'm a big fan of Rob Rousseau. I think this is the first time I've ever seen him say anything I didn't agree with, but I watched fairly closely as this conflict unfolded. I was in IRC chat with people in Kiev each night of the revolution in 2014. And this is when you get also this anecdotal. I'm friends with a bunch of Ukrainian nationalists that supported the Euromaidan. What's going on? I'm listening to the Ukrainians. Well, okay, but which ones though? That's kind of the question. Which ones? I don't doubt that there's many people in Ukraine that are nationalists that did support the Euromaidan and do want to integrate with NATO and the EU. I don't doubt that whatsoever, and do want to get support from NATO and do want to go and fight Russians. I don't deny that whatsoever. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, though. I was chatting to Nazis all night. Fuck. I don't want to suggest that every single person in Ukraine that's kind of become part of this sort of nationalist project is a Nazi, I think I'm sure there's many people that, for whatever reason, are on board with that project, but you do have to also look around at who their partners are in that, and kind of maybe ask some critical questions about why they're partnering up with these open fascists, and why they have these crossover in beliefs about Ukrainian identity and nationalism. that is shared with these like open neo-Nazi groups. I think that's probably the problematic part of that. Here's some more tricky shit from Evan as well. There's a whole other conversation with Warren here. Again, I don't want to be too mean to Warren here. I want to focus on Evan Dyer's role in this conversation. He says, then you know that the Ukrainian left is entirely on board with the Ukrainian government. Evan, that's not true. That's not true, Evan. That's, again, objective journalist Evan Dyer editorializing. That's not a factual statement. The Ukrainian left entirely on board with the Ukrainian government. Does that include the like socialist and communist parties and trade unionists that have been banned? That have been banned over the last several years and especially accelerated over the last year and a half? How like any remotely Russian sympathizing or socialist party has been framed as being traitors. These people are being like beaten and tied to poles and like assaulted and imprisoned. So the idea that the Ukrainian left is entirely on board with the Ukrainian government, as Evan, serious objective journalist Evan Dyer says, that is not true whatsoever. The socialists and communists just agree that they should have been banned. Exactly. That's Evan Dyer editorializing. That's his own personal view of the situation, which is in no way tethered to reality, the actual reality of what's happened. Type Iran into this MF search on Twitter. The dude is an imperialist dog. I don't doubt it, Dimitri. I'm sure there's all kinds of interesting things in there. The Ukrainian left doesn't exist anymore. You can literally be put into prison for singing the Internationale. I mean, it's just a preposterous statement. The Ukrainian left is entirely on board with the Ukrainian government. Just a totally factually incorrect and outrageous statement on the part of Evan there. Yeah, they're National Socialists, which makes them left-wing. There you go. Yeah. It's right there in the name. Exactly right. Are there any links or sources on these? Otherwise, we're doing the same I know a guy thing that we're mocking the other dude for. There's plenty of reporting on this. There's a ton of reporting on this. This is from 20. This is not even during the war. Is fucking Amnesty? Is Amnesty International enough? You know, I know it's not sensible to. It's not reported on anymore. Amnesty International. This is from 2015, after the Euromaidan protest, which NATO and America especially were deeply implicated in. Shortly after the Euromaidan protest, in which this pro-NATO, pro-EU government was installed with the help of the Western imperialists, which of course Evan would deny. Evan Dyer would deny this. This is 2015. Communist Party ban, decisive blow for freedom of speech in the country. As much as we like to talk about Ukraine being this like democracy, this like Western style democracy that Russia's just being mean to and bullying, it's not at all a democracy. And this idea that this completely false idea that the Ukrainian left is entirely on board with the Ukrainian government is proven to be totally completely incorrect by a simple Google search to talk about this years ago, 2015, the banning of these communist parties. So these are mutually exclusive things. The Ukrainian left can't be entirely on board with the Ukrainian government when it's literally illegal to be a member of one of these left-wing parties. This is not just me saying I know a guy. There's been plenty of documentation on this. Again, it's become unfashionable to report on this in the conflict because now it's helping Putin to talk about it. But there's been more than enough. There's been plenty of serious reporting on this. They're entirely on board with the Ukrainian government and the need to defend the country, and many of them are currently in uniform. The split in this thread is what happened in the Western left after Prague 68, where the word tanky comes from, which was another CIA-backed attempted color revolution, of course, which Evan would also deny. The irony here is that at least these tankies were supporting an ideologically aligned power. Putin's Russia, with its orthodox Christian social conservatism, anti-LGBT, militant nationalism, and czarist iconography, looks far more like a fascist country than Ukraine ever could. That I would disagree with as well, considering like all those things that he just said could be used to describe the exact nationalist, anti-Soviet version of Ukraine that is being created right now and that people like Evan support. So, I mean, all those things are totally ideologically similar. As much as we try to like pink wash the Ukrainian government, suggest that it's like a great place to be an LGBTQ person, I don't think that is accurate in any way. And anyway, I agree that there's plenty of things about Putin's Russia, as I articulated before. I think there's plenty of things about Putin's Russia that I think are grotesque. But first of all, we have to look at the role that the West played. As much as Evan would like to deny this, we need to look at the role that the West played in creating that situation. Why is Russia like this? Russia was a progressive, pluralistic, socialist society, and that was too much for us because that was a threat to our economic interests and our economic status quo. And we spent decades and decades and decades and billions of dollars overthrowing that system, leading to this modern version of Russia featuring all these like regressive and reactionary cultural touchstones, which Evan is pointing out here. So that's kind of what I would say about that. You know, and as an anti-imperialist, and you point out the West's role as the world's foremost hegemon and imperialist power, whether you don't need to support the Russian government to recognize the fact that it's providing a counter and opposition to Western imperialism. And that's just the reality. I would prefer that Russia was still socialist. I would prefer to have an anti-Western alliance that was based in socialism, that was based in like, you know, where the Soviet Union still existed. Well, that doesn't exist anymore because of Western imperialism, because Western imperialism destroyed this. So this is the anti-Western alliance that exists such as it is. So if you're anti-imperialist, you just have to grapple with that. You have to grapple with all the contradictions and all the dialectics that are inherent to that. Tankies, and again, showing how serious of a journalist with he is by calling me a fucking tanky. For, again, all of this little outburst on the part of Evan here was in reaction to me saying what Lula is saying in this clip that you're sharing is what the entire rest of the world believes. That's what I was saying. And in Evan's little tantrum here, which was not directed to me, but some other guy, of course, that's all with what that is in reference to, just to be clear about that as well. My totally like benign and factual statement that most people around the world recognize Lula's statement for being completely accurate. Tankies automatically take the anti-Western and/or authoritarian side in any conflict. They also have a Pavlovian reaction to the Putinist use of hammer and sickle symbolism. Are they even using any? I don't think they're using hammer and sickle symbolism at all. I mean, Putin, in the lead up to the invasion, specifically talked shit about Lenin and fucking threw Lenin under the bus and talked about how it was Lenin's fault in the first place for creating Ukraine and carving it out as its own kind of separate nationalist identity. So what? They're specifically going against that kind of symbolism. So what the fuck's he talking about? Putin himself, a massive anti-communist who I pointed out before, benefited personally from the collapse of the Soviet Union. I would like them to use more hammer and sickle symbolism, frankly, but they're not doing that. The Russian troops do use the Soviet flag a lot. Okay, well, maybe that's a part of it. Maybe that's a part of it. Is this where I finally got involved here? Okay. This is like, Evan was quite on one here before I even like interacting with me and engaging in any way with my main point, which again is just inarguably true. The fact that the rest of the world believes this about the conflict. I suppose we also have this is a good point as well, Cinnamon Challenge. I suppose we also have a Pavlovian response to all the fascist imagery that the Ukrainian soldiers use. Exactly. I think we do, yeah. Which Evan just says is some fantasy. He just dismisses that as being some kind of fantasy. But what if Russia attacked a country that the U.S. didn't use as a proxy for 8 years? You tankies would probably support that. Yeah, exactly. What if this was totally different? I'm sure you'd support the same thing. Like, okay, well, we're not talking about Iceland, though. We're talking about this situation, which has a very clear, documented record of heavy involvement of these Western powers. So this whole Iceland thing makes no fucking sense because that's just a completely different situation, which is not happening, versus the situation that is happening that we're discussing now. Yes.
You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
Metal Dipshit, thank you very much for the 5 gifted subs. I really appreciate that, Metal Dipshit. Thank you. Oh boy. I'm going to have to blow my nose again soon. So then this guy gets involved. Gordon Cook. Bless you, Gordon. I don't know if Gordon's part of the community or not. He says, you just demonstrated the idiocy of using the term tanky to refer to the anti-war left. They call for peace talks while you call for literal tanks to be sent. Very good point, Gordon. He says, they're calling for surrender followed by ratification of the territorial gains achieved through armed aggression. They're calling for a perpetuation of the current occupation, which is the opposite of peace. They're not anti-war. They are pro-invasion. And again, that's just false as well. As I've said many times, I'm not pro-invasion. But as I talked about this yesterday, here's the reality that people like Evan don't want to reckon with. There was a time when those eastern regions could have remained part of Ukraine. There was a plenty of opportunity for that to happen. If the Minsk agreements had been followed, none of this would have ever happened, which Russia was negotiating in good faith. None of this shit ever had to happen. The reality, though, now is those regions are gone now. They're not coming back. They're just not going to come back. You don't have to support Putin or support the invasion to just recognize this basic fact. They're not going to happen. It's not happening. Thank you, Metal Dipshit, again. Thank you for stopping by. Take care. Same with Crimea. All this shit about the war can only end. The war can only end when they give back those eastern regions in the Crimea. It's not going to happen. So it's in fact Evan that is arguing for endless war versus a situation where there's a ceasefire and peace and no more violence and bloodshed. That's the reality. Those are the two options. Endless war, endless bloodshed and quagmire, or you call a ceasefire, you admit to yourself and everyone else that those regions are gone and are not coming back, and everyone can stop dying and killing each other. These are the two options that are on the table. Evan supports the perpetual war side. I support the ceasefire side. So yes, it is anti-war. Yeah, and does Evan really want to see what happens if the Donbass was to be put back in the hands of Zelensky and his fascist fucks? That's absolutely right. I mean, if you think that would be a great situation, or that wouldn't involve horrific amounts of retribution and violence in and of itself, I mean, that's just completely delusional. If you don't want an invasion, don't lay down the red carpet of conditions where it could be reasonably assumed Russia would react harshly. Again, Mikey, like we've been talking about, people have been saying for years, we're leading. That's why that Mearsheimer clip is so important. Mearsheimer was saying years ago, we're leading Ukraine down the primrose path. If we keep doing this, Ukraine's going to get wrecked. He wasn't saying that because he thinks Putin is great or because he's a tanky or he's a Kremlin propagandist. He was just stating a basic reality. If we keep doing what we're doing right now, Ukraine's going to get wrecked. Well, lo and behold, that's what happened. So now we can accept that, accept our responsibility in that, and we can work to stop the bloodshed, or like bloodthirsty, drony Evan wants, we can continue that conflict can continue endlessly. And we can let's even escalate it even more. Let's escalate it to nuclear war. Let's escalate it to World War III, because that's what it's going to take to return those regions that now Russia has spent the last year securing. And if people really would rather have World War III over these like eastern regions in Ukraine that they're not in any way connected to, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think we should have World War III over like the Donetsk and Luhansk and these eastern republics filled predominantly with Russian-speaking people who were getting shelled for the last 10 years with NATO weapons. I don't think we should have World War III over these eastern regions in Ukraine, and I don't understand all these Western people who have zero connection to these territories who are willing to like escalate that to that level because Russia bad. You know, that to me is fucking psychotic. When I was a child, my mom told me to stop putting my hands and fingers near my dog's mouth and annoying it. When the dog finally bit me, my mom channeled her inner Tanky and said, "Well, I told you so." Well, your mom supports the authoritarian regime of your dog not wanting to be fucking annoyed endlessly. So here's where I chimed in, because this is after the stream yesterday. I noticed that all this conversation was going on. I didn't even realize because I don't follow Evan, so I wasn't getting these notifications. So this is where I chimed in, because I was like, oh, okay. I see Evan actually responded to some of these things, although, again, not to me, but to some other guy, some random dude. So here's where I chimed in. So let's see this now. This is such a long time of setting this up. I did not think this segment was going to be so long. But let's now look at once I got back involved in this conversation, and we can look at this little back and forth that I had with Evan, and we can talk about who came out on top. And I know maybe some of you might be biased, but let's really dig into this. Just give me one brief moment, though. I'm just going to blow my nose again. I'm so sorry. I'm going to do that and get maybe another beverage, and then I'll come back in just a sec. So just hold that thought. Don't go anywhere. Give me like 2 minutes and I'll be back and we'll talk about it some more. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. This really sucks. I'm really tired of feeling this way. My lungs are really like clogged up and I'm like wheezing. It's fucking not good shit. Ugh. I think my mic was a lot turned down more than it usually is as well today. It's not COVID, it's just a cold. Ugh. Okay. So, as I was saying, this was yesterday at 3:30. This is right after I finished the stream. And I finished the stream yesterday. I had just talked about Evan's comments previously, but I hadn't noticed that he was like responding to it. So this was as soon as I finished the stream, I saw that he was responding. I was like, okay. I saw his fucking sanctimonious comments and his like, I think somewhat slanderous and accusations that I'm this tanky that supports authoritarianism, despite, again, everything that I just looked at Evan saying was in response to me saying, commenting on that clip that he was sharing of Lula, simply saying that the West was responsible for provoking this. The West has played a role in prolonging this conflict. And just pointing out, this is what most of the world believes. All that bullshit that Evan was saying over those last like few paragraphs was in response to that. So didn't reckon with that basic point. You'll notice that that's going to be a common theme here. Not reckoning with the action or responding to in any way the basic point that I'm making. And instead, obfuscating and ducking and dodging and doing everything he possibly can to avoid dealing with the actual points that I'm making here. Ugh. So here I came in. I said that NATO played a role in provoking the conflict through the Euromaidan, to the arming and funding of neo-Nazi militias, to ignoring the Minsk peace agreements. The Minsk peace agreements is just an inarguable truth, which most of the world recognizes. There's been plenty of legitimate reporting on this, Evan. And again, when I try to have these conversations, like I try not to be a dick to people anymore. I think there was a time on Twitter where I would be like, fuck you or whatever, but I try to generally be polite, even if I am.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Ideas.
Tankies for Rob.
Thank you, Cutman, for the 20 months tier 1. Thank you, Cutman. I appreciate that. So I said you ignore all this or hand wave it away because you, whether you realize it or not, are a propagandist for the rules-based international order that the U.S. is in charge of and Canada is a junior partner in. Here's what he said. Evan says, I support a rules-based order called international law. Whether it's invasions of Ukraine or Iraq or occupations of Mariupol or Bethlehem. No double standards. You cannot claim the same consistency. You condemn it when Washington does it, but support it when it's the Kremlin. And again, I don't support it, but what I do point out is the role that the West played in provoking it, which, as I pointed out, is what most of the world believes. As I pointed out, there's tons of mainstream reporting on it. And again, you'll see Evan not reckoning with any of that, just completely ignoring that whole context. They're saying you condemn it when it's Washington, but you support it when it's the Kremlin, while totally ignoring the heavily documented role that, yes, Washington and Ottawa played in this conflict and many other conflicts as well. So I said, what does international law say about helping to overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014 and then spending the next decade providing billions of dollars worth of arms and training to openly neo-Nazi militias who were shelling and killing civilians? And again, this is not some like opinion of mine. This is not some Kremlin conspiracy theory. There's tons of mainstream reporting about all of this stuff. And I look at this similar to the whole Syria argument as well. You talk about Assad and Syria and terrible things that have happened in the Syrian civil war, right? And my point of that has always been like, well, you can't just blame one side for terrible things that happened in a war when we're arming and funding the other side of that war. You know, you don't have to. You can say, yeah, Assad has done terrible things in this war, which I don't think that's disputable. But we're arming and funding these like extreme reactionaries, and like Evan points out in this tweet about Afghanistan, these fundamentalists. Well, in Syria, we're arming and funding these reactionary fundamentalists to fight in this war, where inevitably these terrible things were happening. So we're deeply implicated in that. So when you're talking about international law, what does international law say about us, the West, the United States and Canada, pumping arms to materially support one side of a civil war that we have nothing to do with? Is that just like totally fine? Is that totally okay to do under international law? I genuinely would like to know. Like, this invasion, again, did not just happen in February of 2022. And you can say, yeah, it's illegal to invade another country according to international law. Okay. And I will accept that and acknowledge it. But is it legal under international law to openly support and arm and train and fund one side of a civil war in a certain region, whether it's eastern Ukraine or Syria or Yemen? These are just 3 current examples, or Libya is another example. Is it applicable to international law? Is it legal under international law, that framework, to arm and fund civil wars in regions that have nothing to do with us? That's kind of my question here. What does international law say about helping to overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014 and then spending the next decade providing billions of dollars worth of arms and training to openly neo-Nazi militias who are shelling and killing civilians? Again, this is not controversial. This is not controversial. These are like, this is what has been happening. None of these people ever called for the same rules to be enforced when any of the other mentioned countries did similar things. Yeah, and like Evan points to Iraq, right? Evan likes to point to Iraq as an example of his like objectivity. Ukraine or Iraq, no double standards. So that's Evan's kind of like get out of jail free card. He says, well, the Iraq war was illegal, the Ukraine war, the war against Ukraine is illegal. Again, I'm interested to know. And maybe someone can, does he support sanctions against the U.S.? Does he support war crimes trials against George W. Bush? I don't really think so. If he does, I don't think he's mentioned it too much. And again, I'm interested to know whether Evan Dyer in 2003 was suggesting that the war was illegal and pushing back against it. Maybe he was. If he was, I would love to see the Evan Dyer articles and commentary that he was doing 20 years ago calling the Iraq war illegal. Or does he just sit here in 2023 and say, oh yeah, of course it was illegal, now that it's like totally non-controversial to say that? When it actually mattered, was Evan saying that? I don't know. I kind of doubt it, though. What does Evan think about our involvement in Afghanistan post 9/11? Well, according to this tweet here, he seems to think that it was justified because of the fundamentalist rule in Afghanistan and the Taliban and not letting girls go to school and the human rights issues there. So it kind of seems like he thinks it was justified because of the Afghanistan regime, the Taliban that was in place. What was the Taliban doing there? Well, again, as much as Evan doesn't want to admit it, the West literally did impose that on the people of Afghanistan. And when there was an alternative system to that was being created with the PDPA in the late 70s, we armed and funded these very
You can count on me. You're going to have good old
to
Rob to talk you through all this.
In an exact similar situation, in an almost identical situation to what's going on currently in Ukraine. Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Diego, for another gifted sub to Updragon. I really appreciate that, Diego. Thank you. So that's his kind of get out of jail free card. Iraq's illegal. Was Evan calling Iraq illegal in 2003? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that he was. Do you think there's a mentality now that if a concession is made for Putin, he'll see this as an opportunity to try something similar to the invasion? I mean, that's the narrative that people have been using to justify their position that there should be no possible negotiation or whatever. But no, I don't think so. I think in the same way that, like, you know, you only believe that if you think Putin is Hitler and Putin is like trying to, as our friend earlier in the chat was trying to say, trying to reestablish the Russian Empire. And if he's just going to be emboldened and go into all these other places. He's in Ukraine because of his very specific set of conditions. And Russia did try to avoid that situation for quite a long time before finally committing to do this invasion. So I don't think there's any evidence of that whatsoever. I mean, they've had a hard enough time over the last year and a half securing their gains in Ukraine. I don't think Russia has a ton of appetite to continue that, like, moving beyond that. I really don't. But I know that's a very commonly held belief for people that are in this kind of like, we must never back down, we must fight to the last Ukrainian kind of viewpoint. Evan says you condemn it when Washington does it, but support it when it's the Kremlin. So I asked, what does international law say about helping to overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014? And then spending the next decade providing billions of dollars worth of arms and training to openly neo-Nazi militias who were shelling and killing civilians. This Evan is very tricky guy. So he says simultaneously, international law is very clear on that actually, Rob. It says countries are not allowed to invade other countries. That is why the U.S. invasion of Iraq was illegal. Countries are fully entitled to defend themselves and take action on their own soil to recover stolen land. So no actual answer to this, right? Zero effort to actually engage with that point whatsoever, or engage with my other point about how most of the world believes that it was provoked. Zero effort to engage with this. He just says invasion bad, Russia bad. That's his only answer. Completely, like, as much as he's saying, you imagine this Nazi problem, you imagine Western involvement. When I say, what about these specific examples, these specific documented examples of Western involvement? Do we share any blame for that? Zero answer. Zero effort to respond to that in any way. And here's where I get the fucking sanctimonious lecture. And listen, I try to be respectful. I try to be respectful with Evan here or anyone else that I argue with about this. And I say that's not a response to what I asked. And this fucking, I'm sorry, Evan, but you're a condescending prick, sir. This is fucking condescending bullshit. Still not answering any of my questions. And he says, I think you should probably, A, learn more about international law and why it exists. B, examine your double standards. And C, ask yourself why your double standards consistently operate in favor of dictatorships and rights-abusing regimes and against democracies. So, I mean, you see the ideology right there in that last thing, right? The dictatorships and rights-abusing regimes and against democracies like Canada and the United States, who, of course, are not rights-abusing and, of course, are not authoritarian. So you see the ideology right there just in the language that he uses, and who qualifies as being a democracy and who doesn't, and who qualifies as being, authoritarian and who doesn't, and who qualifies as being rights abusing and who does not. So here's my final response to Evan here. And again, as I said, if you're going to be sanctimonious with me, if you think you can out passive aggressive me, if you want to try and give me a sanctimonious, condescending lecture, well, guess what? I can give that right back. So I said, thanks. While we're giving suggestions, you should examine how terms like democracy, human rights, and authoritarianism are weaponized to uphold an exploitative world order. And B, stop obscuring the role of the global hegemon in international affairs like the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And finally, C, use your platform to more forcefully advocate for the right of Palestinians to engage in armed struggle in illegal Israeli settlements, which you agree is legal under international law. Right? Because that goes back to this point that he made here. Countries are fully entitled to defend themselves and take action on their own soil to recover stolen land. Again, I've heard that Evan is better on Israel-Palestine than many other journalists in this country. I don't know that I've seen any arguments from Evan openly advocating for the right, the legal right, which he recognizes here, which he agrees is legal under international law, the legal right for Palestinians to engage in armed struggle, to take action on their own soil to recover stolen land. The Israeli settlements are illegal. There's illegal, under international law, Israeli settlements that go beyond the borders that have been agreed upon. These settlements are illegal. So under Evan's own definition, is apparently like fucking genius interpretation, his complex grasp, his total iron-fisted grasp on international law and these concepts. Under that definition, Palestinians have the legal right to, as he says, take action on their own soil to recover stolen land. Has Evan ever articulated that? And if he has, I would love to see that. And if that's true, I would be interested to know whether his bosses at CBC know that that's what he believes, because I don't think that's a very commonly held belief among CBC journalists, that Palestinians have the right to engage in armed struggle in these occupied illegal settlements. Or do indigenous people in Canada and the United States, do the Wet'suwet'en have that right? They're being military occupied. They're a sovereign people. Their land is being occupied. All the treaties that they signed were all bullshit in the first place, and they're being the terms of the treaties are being constantly violated. They're being threatened with the RCMP and state violence. Do the Wet'suwet'en have the right, the legal right under international law, to pick up an AK-47 and engage in armed struggle against settlers in Canada and the United States? I'd be interested to know if Evan has ever articulated that viewpoint. Or is it just Ukrainians? Is it just Ukrainians that have this right to defend themselves and take action to recover the stolen land? I'd be interested to see. I don't think I've ever seen Evan ever make this argument about Palestinians or indigenous people in Canada and the United States. Evan really going off today. Maybe I set him off on this. Evan. From a Reuters article, he's claiming Reuters now is communist Cuban propaganda. The headline is Cuban President Diaz-Canel expected to win second term despite crises. He says this article reads like it was written by the Cuban Communist Party. An ill-informed person reading it might think he or she is reading about a real democratic election. Again, who qualifies it? It's only a Western-style liberal democracy. That's the only possible form of democracy. Any system outside of that is authoritarian, according to non-biased, non-partisan journalist Evan. And I must say, Evan, you're not a journalist. You know this. Evan, you're not a journalist. You know this. I think that's the end of my rant. That's the end of the interaction that I had with Evan Dyer. I think you will agree. You know, I don't want to speak for you, chat, but I think you will agree that I did own Evan in the marketplace of ideas. The likes have spoken. I'm sure you'll agree. But is it me who propagandize? No, they must be uninformed. That's right. He's a bootlicker mouthpiece for the status quo. It's unfortunately true. I tried to make a dent in Evan's programming. I tried to make a dent in Evan's fucking programming. I know Evan is someone that would think that we don't have state media. He works for CBC. CBC is not state media. They're having this freak out now about Elon Musk describing them as being government funded, which is true. I fucking hate Elon Musk, but that is true. And I'm sure Evan would say that he's non-biased, he's non-partisan.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. You
see in this interaction, you see the ideology.
Fun times.
Red Eastby, thank you for the 2 months tier 1. Thank you, Red Eastby. So you see the ideology in this argument. You see it pop out, and you see that Evan Dyer, no matter how much he claims to the contrary, he is a stenographer for the state, for our current status quo. And that maybe he's nonpartisan, but he's still a stenographer for the power structure in this country. Evan is literally mad at Trudeau for not being anti-Cuba enough. But Evan doesn't have ideology. Trudeau government's position on democracy in the Americas remains confused and contradictory. It sanctions Nicaragua and Venezuela. but calls the most complete one-party state in the hemisphere, Cuba, an ally. His government is loath to criticize as it jails its youth for asking for change. Oh, Evan. Oh, Evan. Evan, you're not a journalist. You know this. I would really be interested to see what Evan was saying about Iraq in 2003. I don't know if there's any way to find that out. I don't really feel like Googling it now. Anyway, folks, I got to take a break from talking. I really do. I guess the stupid Elon Musk. We can just take a look at the Elon Musk CBC. Like, it's so stupid. Like, I think this is an important point to talk about, the fact that we do indeed have state media and propaganda in our society, and this distinction between state-controlled media when it's in another country versus CBC and BBC not getting it. But it's like, I fucking hate that it's Elon Musk, the most pathetic, unfunny loser, the one making this point for entirely the wrong reasons, you know? It's very annoying. It's very annoying. And as I talked about in this tweet, and as we talked about up front at the beginning of this conversation, you know, it's all state media. It's all state media. If you live in a capitalist country, when capitalists own your media, as Lenin tells us, then it is automatic. It's a capitalist press. It's a corrupt press. And as our friend here, Ramuskin Red, points out, our boy said it best: for the bourgeoisie, freedom of the press meant freedom for the rich to publish and for the capitalists to control the newspapers, a practice which in all countries, including even the freest, produced a corrupt press. You know, sometimes that guy said some pretty smart things.